The bride took the Winchester from beside the church door and fired before the preacher finished the word covenant. Her bullet snapped the lamp chain above the last pew, and the falling glass burst at the boots of the man creeping up behind Sheriff Harlan Pike, with a pistol tucked against his leg. By the time the flames licked across the pine boards and folks began screaming, the woman in white had already worked the lever once, stepped in front of the sheriff, and set the barrel level with the intruder's throat. Harlan drew on instinct, the cold weight of his Colt rising before his thoughts caught up. "Who taught you to shoot like that?" he asked the bride. She did not look at him when she answered. She looked at the man on the floor, at the little black snake of powder burn crawling up his trouser cuff, and said, very calm, "My husband taught me the first part. The men who killed him taught me not to miss." Something in the church went still after that. Even the crying seemed to stop and listen. Before we go any farther, settle in wherever you are tonight, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Red Bluff was a small place with one church, one jail, one muddy main street, and more secrets than good sense. But stories like this are never carried by one town alone. The preacher's wife smothered the spreading flame with the hem of a wool shawl. Old Mrs. Bramble, who ran the boarding house and could curse in 2 languages without repeating herself, planted her thick shoes in the aisle and announced that if anybody fainted, they would be left wherever they fell. That brought people back into their bodies. The man on the floor reached for his pistol. The bride lowered her Winchester half an inch and shot the weapon out of his hand, so clean it skidded beneath the altar and came to rest against the preacher's boot. No one in the church said a word after that. Harlan crossed the room, holstered his Colt, and planted a knee between the intruder's shoulders. He was a tall man, all dry angles and restraint, with a face that had forgotten what rest looked like some years back. He tied the man's wrists with the white ribbon that had been meant for the bride's bouquet and searched his pockets. From the inside of the man's coat, he drew a folded paper, a silver watch with no chain, and a tintype of the bride standing beside a porch rail, unsmiling, in a dress too dark for summer. That was when Harlan finally looked at her properly. Her name was Ada Marin. She had arrived in Red Bluff 2 days earlier on the afternoon coach, carrying 1 carpet bag, 1 cedar box, and a letter saying she had agreed to marry the sheriff of Red Bluff if the sheriff of Red Bluff was still willing. They had exchanged letters for 4 months, cautious ones at first, then longer ones after winter broke. He had told her the truth as best he knew it, that his wife Clara had been dead 3 years, that the house was quiet enough to ring in a man's ears, that he had no talent for charm and no patience for drinking, that he wanted honesty, work shared fairly, and no meanness under his roof. She had written back that honesty suited her. She liked early mornings, could mend almost anything that held still long enough, and had no wish to be admired by fools. Until that moment in the church, Harlan had figured he knew the shape of the woman he was marrying. He had not. Deputy Owen Bell came hurrying in from outside, one hand on the hat that never sat straight on his head. He had a clove tucked in his cheek and the habit of wiping his palms on his thighs when he was nervous. Seeing the scene, he blinked once and said, "Sheriff, should I fetch the doc, the undertaker, or more rope?" "Rope first," Harlan said. Owen moved. Ada still held the Winchester steady. Her wedding dress was plain muslin, altered neatly from something older, and she wore it like a woman tolerated it for the sake of getting through a necessary errand. There was a faint smudge of soot at the edge of her jaw. The barrel did not shake. "You know him?" Harlan asked. "Yes." "Name?" "Elias Rourke." The man spat blood onto the church floor. "You should have kept running." Ada's face changed then, but only in the eyes. Not fear. Something older. Something worn down so far it had gone sharp. "You had your chance to bury me," she said. "You did a poor job." Mrs. Bramble inhaled hard through her nose. "Well," she muttered, "I like her." Folks started talking all at once after that. Red Bluff's merchant, Mr. Speck, who cleaned his spectacles whenever truth got too near him, said he had known there was something odd about the whole arrangement. Ruth Kessler, the blacksmith's widow with the burn scar across one wrist, said odd was preferable to dead. The preacher kept rubbing at the place where his collar pin sat, though he had taken it off before the ceremony. Harlan hauled Elias to his feet and marched him toward the church door. Ada followed as far as the threshold, then stopped, one hand on the frame. Outside, the sun sat high and indifferent over the town, light hard on the hitch rails. Wind carrying dust and hoarse sweat and the sharp smell of cut pine from the mill. "You're coming with me," Harlan said. "I figured that. Are we still getting married?" Mrs. Bramble called from behind them. Ada surprised him then. "If he still wants the trouble." The crowd hushed again. Harlan looked at the ribbon cutting into Elias Rourke's wrists, at the tintype in his pocket, at Ada standing in a wedding dress with smoke on her cheek and a rifle in her hands like it belonged there. Then he said, "Preacher's still standing, ain't he?" The preacher straightened. "I am." "Then we'll finish it after I lock this man up." Ada studied him a long second, as if measuring whether he understood the price of what he was saying. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "there are easier women to marry." He met her eyes. "I never asked for easy." That line stayed with people in Red Bluff for years. He locked Elias Rourke in the single iron cell at the back of the jail and found, sewn into the man's vest lining, a brass hotel token from Cheyenne, a train stub dated 6 days earlier, and a scrap torn from a freight ledger. Written on the back in blunt pencil were 4 words. "She carries what's mine." Harlan read them once, then again. When he stepped back into the front office, Ada stood by the potbelly stove with her hands empty now, the Winchester leaning against his desk. The wedding dress made her look softer than she was. The way she stood told the truth. "Is there something of yours a man like him would cross 2 territories to fetch?" he asked. "Yes." "What is it? If I tell you now, you won't marry me. You don't know that." She gave him a look so sad it near passed for patience. "No, I do." Harlan had spent 3 years in the company of lies, grief, and paperwork. He could hear the shape of a true thing, even when someone gave him only the edge of it. Whatever she carried, it had blood on it. Not literal, perhaps, but blood all the same. Outside, church bells should have been ringing. Instead, there was only wind bumping the sign above the jail and the dull stomp of a restless horse at the hitch rail. The point of no return came not with a kiss, nor with a vow, but with the scrape of Ada's ring against the sheriff's desk as she laid her left hand flat and let him see that another band had once lived there a very long time. "I can leave before dark," she said. "Folks in town will sleep easier." Harlan looked at the paper in his hand. "She carries what's mine." Then he tore the note clean in half. "No," he said. "My wife don't ride out alone because some bastard thinks he can collect her like freight." Ada stared at him as if the room had shifted beneath her feet. That was the moment nothing could go back to what it had been. He married her an hour later with soot still on the church floor, a prisoner in his cell, and half the town convinced he had taken leave of his senses. A marriage begun under gun smoke could still have been set aside in the morning. It might even have been the sensible thing. But sense stopped maturing just before sundown, when Ada opened her cedar box in the little back room of the jailhouse home, took out a narrow leather-bound ledger wrapped in a child's nightdress, and told Harlan exactly why men kept trying to bury her. Her first husband, Jacob Marin, had worked figures for a cattle magnate named Silas Reddick. Reddick owned stockyards, freight contracts, and half the fear between Nebraska and Wyoming. He had made his fortune buying up land from widows and old men too worn out to fight. If they would not sell, their taxes mysteriously rose. If that failed, their wells failed. If that failed, barns burned. Jacob had kept Reddick's books until he found 2 ledgers instead of 1. The clean set for bankers and judges, and the real set, with names, bribes, false liens, hired fires, and the dates next to each. He said a man could survive being poor, Ada told Harlan, sitting rigid at the edge of the bed as evening light went copper in the window. Could survive being frightened, too, if he had to. But there was something in him couldn't survive writing down the ruin of decent people and calling it numbers. So Jacob had copied the real accounts into a smaller ledger and planned to take it to a federal circuit judge in Laramie. He never made it. Reddick's men caught them on the road near Elk Crossing. Jacob bought Ada time with his life. "He told me to run west," she said. "Said if I got far enough, maybe the truth would outlive him." Harlan leaned against the washstand, arms crossed, his badge glinting faintly in the dim. "And you wrote to me because?" "Because your first letter said you hated bullies, lying men, and cold biscuits." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I figured any one of those was useful." All 3 seemed promising. He should not have liked that as much as he did. "That all?" "No." She looked down at the ledger in her lap. "I wrote because I was tired of sleeping with my boots on." Silence settled between them, carrying the stove's tick and the distant rattle of harness from the livery. "Why not take it straight to the judge?" he asked. I tried twice. Reddick's men were waiting once. The second time the stage driver sold my route for whiskey. She lifted her eyes. The circuit judge is due through Red Bluff in 3 days. I thought if I was under a sheriff's roof, maybe I'd live long enough to hand it over. And marrying me? She gave a small, hard shrug. A woman traveling alone is seen. A sheriff's wife is overlooked until it's too late. There it was. Not romance. Not rescue. Strategy tied up with desperation. Honest enough to sting. Harlan knew something about being chosen for usefulness. After Clara and their little girl had died in a fire set by a drifter he had once jailed, people treated him like a cracked plate still good enough for the shelf, but not the table. Useful. Sad. Best left undisturbed. He sat opposite her. You should have told me sooner. I did not expect to like your letters, she said. That complicated matters. The truth of that landed clean. In the morning, Red Bluff reacted exactly as towns do when trouble becomes local. Men who had called Harlan stubborn started calling him reckless. Women who had pitted his loneliness now pitted his judgment. Mr. Speck at the Mercantile said the town ought to distance itself from outsiders carrying vendettas. Ruth Kessler bought Ada a work apron and told Mr. Speck he was welcome to distance himself all the way to hell. Mrs. Bramble arrived with biscuits and said, You can trust a woman who waits to lie until she has a better reason than vanity. Deputy Owen, who was suspicious by nature but not unkind, asked Harlan in private whether the marriage was legal enough to hold. Harlan answered that if Owen wanted to examine the preacher's memory, he was welcome to try. Ada spent the day shedding the dress and taking up ordinary tasks. She patched a torn curtain, scrubbed the stove top, and spoke gently to the half-starved stray dog that had haunted the jail's back steps for months until it crawled under the porch to sleep. She moved with the competence of someone who had learned long ago that work could keep fear from getting ideas. Near evening, Harlan found her out back, aiming at a row of bottles set on the fence. She held his spare revolver, not the Winchester, and fired 6 shots in a line so fast the glass kept breaking after the sound had ended. You were right, he said. About what? If you'd told me all this before yesterday, I wouldn't have married you. She lowered the gun, eyes unreadable. I'd have ridden east and married you sooner, he said. That startled a real smile out of her, brief and bright enough to hurt. Then she sobered. You don't owe me gallantry, Harlan. Ain't gallantry. What is it then? He looked out toward the far ridge where dusk was settling blue over the grass. Recognition, I suppose. She turned the revolver in her hand and said the first of the lines people would later repeat back to each other like scripture. Folks call a woman dangerous when fear quits making her polite. Harlan took that in. So did the evening. If you were standing where she stood, with blood behind you and law riding toward you under another man's name, what would you have done? Would you have trusted the sheriff? Or would you have saddled a horse and vanished before dawn? I suspect most of us would like to think we'd stay. Knowing and doing are often strangers. The space for choosing closed that night. Just after supper, with the sky still holding a thin seam of red in the west, 10 riders came into Red Bluff in a dust cloud. At their front rode Silas Reddick. He was not a large man, which somehow made him worse. He wore black broadcloth too fine for the country and spoke with the easy softness of men used to being obeyed before they finished a sentence. His horse was a shining bay. His boots were polished. Cruelty sat on him like good tailoring. On his right rode a territorial marshal named Boone Dace, who smiled the way a knife might if it learned to. Reddick dismounted in front of the jail, brushed dust from his cuffs, and held up a paper with a blue seal. Evening, Sheriff. I've come for Mrs. Marin, he said. Or Mrs. Pike, if you prefer the newest lie. She is wanted for the murder of her husband, Jacob Marin, and for theft of business records belonging to my company. Ada had come to the office door before Harlan could stop her. The sight of Reddick did not make her step back. It made her still. You hanged him with fence wire, she said. Reddick smiled. And yet here you are making accusations in public with no proof at all. You do grieve untidily. Harlan read the warrant. It had seals enough to frighten a lesser town and signatures enough to ruin a lesser man. She stays in my custody, Harlan said. Marshal Dace leaned on the hitch rail. You have no grounds. I have a house full of grounds. Start with armed intrusion at a church this morning. That was regrettable, Reddick said, as if discussing whether. But the woman inspires poor judgment in men. Harlan had to make a choice then. Easy path. Surrender her. Keep the badge. Protect the town from open war. Hard path. Refuse and pit one shabby jail, one deputy with clove breath, and a town full of half-brave people against money, papers, and hired guns. The easy path cost less. It also cost him himself. She's my wife, he said. And while I'm sheriff, no one takes a citizen from Red Bluff on the word of a thief. Reddick's eyes shifted then, first to Ada, then back to Harlan, and for the first time there was interest in them. So he said softly, "You are the sort that needs to learn personally." The storm began after midnight. They came quiet. Too quiet for drunks, too disciplined for locals. Harlan heard the first scrape at the window latch and rolled from bed before the second. Ada was already up, barefoot on the floorboards, revolver in hand, hair unbound over her shoulders. The front glass shattered inward. Shotgun blasts punched splinters from the wall. Deputy Owen shouted once, then again, and the second sound cut off ugly. "Backroom," Harlan said. Ada did not argue. She snatched up the ledger from beneath the loose board by the stove, wrapped it in the nightdress, and jammed it inside her coat. Harlan fired through the door before it gave way. A man screamed. Another cursed. Smoke filled the room bitter and hot. There was no time for thinking wide. Only narrow. Window. Alley. Stable. They went through the rear, crouched low beneath the wash line, and ran for the lean-to behind the jail while bullets chewed splinters from the fence. Bare feet on cold dirt, breath tearing. Ada was beside him the whole way. Not behind. Beside. He saw Owen then, slumped near the water trough, blood slick on his temple but breathing. Harlan veered toward him. Ada caught his sleeve. "No. He's alive. And if you stop, he won't stay that way." There are moments when mercy and strategy come dressed alike, and moments when they do not. This one did not. Harlan tore free anyway, dragged Owen by the collar into the trough shadow, and took a bullet through the upper arm for the trouble. Pain flashed white. Ada fired twice. One attacker dropped. The other went limping behind the smokehouse. They made the stable. Harlan got the door barred with his good hand while Ada saddled 2 horses in the dark, as quick as prayer. He was losing blood fast enough to feel the edges of the world loosen. She ripped a strip from her petticoat, knotted it above the wound with her teeth, and said, "Stay angry, Sheriff. Men fade when they get polite." They rode out the back cut, through the dry wash north of town. Behind them Red Bluff's night broke open with shouting and hoofbeats. At the creek crossing Harlan almost blacked out. Ada hauled him down from the saddle and half-dragged, half-cursed him beneath a shelf of rock, while moonlight silvered the water. "Ledger," he muttered. "I have it. Town. Still there. Reddick will burn the jail." He already did. He laughed once at that, a dry broken sound. "You sound annoyed. I am tired of men setting fire to my life." Hoofbeats crossed the creek above them. Voices. Marshal Dace. Reddick's smooth tone beneath it. Then another voice Harlan knew too well from memory rather than presence. The rasping cough of a man called Fenton Greaves, one of the drifters he had once suspected in Clara's fire and never managed to prove. Harlan felt the old years tilt. Ada heard it in his breathing. "You know them. One of them. From where?" He watched moonlight move over the creek stones. "The man who coughed just now worked freight south of Casper 3 summers ago. Clara died that year." Ada understood at once. That was one of her gifts. Not softness. Recognition. "You think Reddick sent him then, too?" "I think men like that don't invent one sin at a time." The riders moved on. They hid until dawn in an abandoned line shack up the draw, flies buzzing against the window screen, heat climbing hard once the sun cleared the ridge. Ada cleaned Harlan's wound with boiled water and whiskey. He bit down on a strip of leather and let her work. She had steady hands. She had done this before. That was a grief of its own. When she finished, she sat on the floor beside the bed frame with her back against the wall, eyes closed. Dust streaked her hem. Dried blood darkened one sleeve. Without the gun, without the set of her mouth, she looked near exhausted enough to vanish. "Did he hurt you?" Harlan asked. "Reddick?" "No." "Jacob?" Her eyes opened at once. "Never." He nodded once. "Had to know." "I know." She looked at the opposite wall. "My father did. Hurt us, I mean. Jacob was the first man ever handed me a cup before he asked me to work." That small truth changed the room. She told him then about the sister she had once failed to protect, a girl younger by 6 years with a laugh too loud for their father's liking. One night Ada had frozen when the shouting started. By the time she moved, the damage was done. Her sister had lived, then died 2 winters later from the kind of marriage a frightened girl accepts because she no longer believes there are better men in the world. I have spent years hating the part of me that froze, Ada said. Even after I learned not to. Harlan lay quiet a while. Wind rubbed dry sage against the cabin steps. Somewhere far off a hawk cried. Then he gave her the line she would carry for the rest of her life. A wound ain't the same thing as a flaw, he said. It's just pain that had to learn a shape. She bowed her head at that, as if something inside her had finally been given permission to rest. He told her about Clara then, about the threats he had dismissed as bluster, about staying late at the office one evening because there were drunks in the street and somebody had to be sheriff, about coming home to smoke and the nursery window black with heat, about how a man can live after that and still not believe he has any right to gentleness. Ada climbed up beside him carefully, mindful of the wound. She pressed a cool hand to his cheek. Not possessive, not tentative, simply there. Harlan, she said, and her voice had lost all its armor. You are not the fire. He closed his eyes because there are truths too heavy to meet looking straight on. She took Jacob's ring from the chain she wore hidden at her throat and placed it in his palm. I kept this because I thought love was something you paid for afterward with fear. I don't want to think that anymore. He curled his fingers around the ring, then reached beneath his shirt and pulled free the little brass star pin Clara had once sewn onto their daughter's blanket because the child loved shiny things. He set it in Ada's hand. Then let's bury the right ghosts, he said. Their kiss was quiet, the kind that asks nothing except honesty and answers with the same. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we tell these stories for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep bringing people like Ada and Harlan all the way home. Warmth came into the room after that. But not safety. Safety was still a country away. By late afternoon, Owen Bell found them. Hat missing, clove gone, one eye swollen nearly shut. He had tracked Harlan's horse through the wash because, as he put it, you always ride like the devil is picky about hoof prints. He brought news. Reddick had burned the jail office and claimed Ada fled after confessing to murder. Mr. Speck backed that lie publicly. Ruth Kessler had broken one of Reddick's men's fingers with a shoeing hammer. Mrs. Bramble was feeding half the town and insulting the other half. Most important, the circuit judge had arrived early and would hold petitions in the church at noon the next day before riding on. One more thing, Owen said, shifting his weight. Reddick's got the bank, the merchant, and Marshall Dace standing with him. But he don't have all the widows. Ada straightened. What widows? The ones Jacob wrote about, I suppose. Ruth. Mrs. Tolland out by the creek. The Vega sisters. Women he squeezed off parcels and thought too tired to remember numbers. Harlan looked at Ada. Ada looked at the ledger. The thing she had carried as a burden might yet become a weapon no bullet could match. They rode into town just before dawn, not by the main road, but by the cottonwood flats behind the smithy. Ruth Kessler met them with a rifle across her apron and nodded as if brides appeared from ambushes every week. Mrs. Bramble stitched Harlan's shirt over the bandage and said if anyone died today, they were at least going to look pressed. By 10 o'clock, Red Bluff knew Ada had returned. By 11, the church was full. Reddick stood near the front pew with Marshall Dace and 3 hired men. He wore gray now, not black, as if trying on respectability for the judge. Judge Abram Sloan was a thin old rider with spectacles low on his nose and dust still on his boots, which Harlan liked immediately. The good judges looked traveled. Sloan called the room to order. Petitions, claims, disputes. Reddick rose first, smooth as oil, and laid out his accusation. Ada Marin had murdered her husband for money, stolen business records, deceived Sheriff Pike into a fraudulent marriage, incited violence, and endangered the peace of Red Bluff. When he finished, Judge Sloan turned to Ada. Do you answer? She stood. There are moments when a person stops trying to survive a story and decides to direct its ending. That was hers. I do, she said. Then she placed the little ledger on the communion table where everyone could see it. She did not begin with her husband's death. She began with names. Martha Tolland, 40 acres by the creek, false lien. Inez and Paloma Vega, father's debt doubled after death, signatures forged. Ruth Kessler, blacksmith lease altered after her husband was buried. One by one she read them out in a voice that did not rise and therefore carried farther. The church changed as she spoke. Shoulders straightened. Faces hardened. Women who had spent years being told their losses were bad luck heard the pattern in them. Reddick interrupted twice. Judge Sloan silenced him once. The second time Ada did. "You may have bought the papers," she said, "but you did not buy the truth. You only delayed who got to say it aloud." Then she produced the second thing she had hidden all this time. Not just Jacob's copy, but 3 original slips he had taken from Reddick's office with Boone Dace's signature beside payment entries for arson and intimidation. Boone went pale. Reddick did not. Men like him rarely believe the room can truly turn until it has already done it. So he made the mistake prideful men always make. He reached for force when persuasion failed. He snatched Judge Sloan by the collar, dragged him backward, and put a pistol to the old man's head. The church erupted. Benches scraped. Someone cried out. Harlan moved, but Ada's hand shot out and stopped him for half a second. It was enough. Reddick backed toward the door, gun at the judge's temple, eyes bright now with the pure animal temper beneath the polish. "Nobody follows," he said. "The woman comes with me." Ledger 2. Ada took one step forward. All the town could see was a bride in a plain blue day dress now. No veil, no lace, no softness except the kind she chose. What Harlan saw was the exact point where grief, love, and fury had finished making someone formidable. "You still think I'm carrying this ledger for my own life," she said. "Aren't you?" "No," she lifted her chin. "I'm carrying it for every woman you priced like livestock." He fired then, not at her, but at the church rafters, showering splinters. Ada had been waiting for the noise. She drew from beneath her skirt hem where she had strapped the little revolver Ruth Kessler lent her, pivoted, and shot the church bell rope just above the knot. The heavy brass bell outside slammed once with such force the judge ducked on instinct. Reddick's grip shifted, and Harlan moved. Not rescue. Partnership. Harlan drove Boone Dace into the pew rail hard enough to break it. Owen tackled one hired gun. Ruth Kessler laid another out cold with the butt of her rifle. Mrs. Bramble, God bless her, hit Mr. Speck with a Bible for trying to crawl under a bench. Reddick recovered fast and bolted through the side door, Judge stumbling free. Ada went after him. Out in the bright noon light, the street flashed white with dust. Reddick ran for the livery where a fresh horse waited saddled. He was fast enough to reach the stirrup. Ada was faster in the way that mattered. "Silas," she called. He turned, because vanity is the last weakness to leave a cruel man. She shot the hitching knot, not him. The frightened horse lunged sideways, tore free, and slammed him into the trough hard enough to drop the pistol. By the time he pushed up sputtering and furious, Ada had the revolver on him, and half the town was at her back. He looked then, really looked, and saw what power fears most. Not one enemy, but witnesses who have stopped agreeing to be alone. "You won't shoot me in front of all these people," he said. Ada's expression did not change. "No," she said. "Living broke will suit you better." That was the true defeat. Judge Sloan signed emergency seizure orders that afternoon based on the ledger and sworn testimony. Boone Dace was stripped of his authority before sunset. Mr. Speck tried to insist he had always doubted Reddick's character and was informed by Mrs. Bramble that hypocrisy was not a defense recognized in decent company. Silas Reddick did not ride out with dignity. He was taken east in irons 3 days later after more ledgers were found in a freight safe under his company seal. His bank notes were frozen. His land claims were suspended. Parcels stolen through fraud reverted pending hearing. And in Red Bluff, that meant widows who had been treated like paperwork finally slept one night on land that was theirs again. As for Red Bluff, towns can repent in practical ways. Men who had muttered about strangers repaired the jail roof. Women who had watched from curtains brought jars of preserves and bolts of cloth. Owen Bell, head bandaged and pride dented, carved a new sign for the office that read Pike Bell in steadier letters than his hands usually managed, then scratched Emress. Pike below it much smaller, and blushed for an entire afternoon when Ada thanked him. Harlan did not ask Ada if the marriage should stand. He asked if she wanted new curtains in the bedroom or the kitchen first. She said the bedroom, which was answer enough. Months later, when spring came easy and green along the creek, the house behind the jail no longer sounded empty. The stray dog had adopted the porch. Ruth Kessler came Sundays with pie. Mrs. Tolland brought cuttings for the yard. On some evenings Ada still checked the window latches twice, and on some nights Harlan still woke with fire in his throat, but healing had quit pretending to be grand. It had become ordinary, which is the holiest shape it takes. One dusk, while Ada pinned Wash on the line and Harlan stood behind her with a basket balanced against his hip, she looked back over her shoulder and said, smiling, "Some homes are built with timber. The lasting ones are built from the people who stay." At the far end of the yard, the white sheets lifted together in the evening wind like a row of quiet flags surrendering nothing. Next time, we'll tell the story of the deaf seamstress sent to a cattle ranch because her brothers were ashamed to keep her, and the scarred horse breaker who learned her language before he ever touched her hand. It begins with a storm, a broken fence, and a secret buried under the barn floor.